case, you may come out of this pretty well, because what will happen is demand will contract to your resource capability. If, on the other hand, you've actually been able to find good quality lawyers and you've tooled up, then there are going to be some challenges as demand contracts. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Now, the thing that makes firms either drop out of the sky or go on through successive growth curves is an ability to run the firm strategically, if you will. It's all about an ability to galvanise a consistent culture. Now, what I mean is, if I was to look at some skills of management, I would say, okay, there are three things that are really going to get your firm to this point that we'll define as success. One of which is process excellence, one of which is product leadership, and one of which is client intimacy. So you've got to have clients who know you and like you and refer you. You've got to be able to produce good products, and you've got to have good systems and processes. It's intuitively obvious, isn't it? Interestingly enough, though, what makes firms go on to succeed and to develop their full potential is, in fact, not the ability to do all those three with equal degrees of excitement. It's all about your ability to do one without disregard of the other. So it's a question of priority. Now, in order to survive the economic challenges that we're going to see, in my view, you're going to be one of these three, not all of these three. So if you try and do all three of those things, what happens is inevitably your firm just plateaus. And the reason is because product offering really has to match organisational culture. So in shorthand, let me just run through the three choices here. The first one of which is process excellence. Typically low margin, high volume work. It's at the bottom end of the demand curve. So for those of you who remember your high school economics, you would have constructed a series of demand curves, plotting price relative to quantity demanded to reflect a downward sloping curve. That reflects the Australian legal market. It's divided into three sections. There's method-based work or commodity work down the bottom, branded work that sits in the middle, and work up here, which is essentially relatively unique or ideas or information-based work. Process work is work where you can see, by the way I've drawn this, small fluctuations in price are going to be accompanied by significantly greater than proportionate fluctuations in quantity demanded. It's highly price elastic. But firms who succeed in delivering that sort of work do so because their cost of production is so low. It's not unusual. Frankly, I've got several clients who work in this area whose leverage, in other words, employed lawyers per equity principal, whose leverage is in excess of 100 to 1. That's why it's such a profitable. All of the mega profit firms in the world do process-focused work. All right, they tend not to be in the lofty areas of they're not the firms that Financial Review's fascinated in and Lawyers Weekly's fascinated in. They're doing usually one thing relatively well, low margin, high volume. Product leaders are the firms who are typically, you have to be very large to be a product leader. So when we look at firms like Allens, Mallisons, Clayton Utz, you can keep your list going. They're product leadership firms. Their services are unique, very high level of experience, difficult to leverage, and typically leverage rates of around 3.5 to 1, very expensive services to deliver. Client intimate firms are the firms who essentially get to that enviable mantle of trusted advisor of choice. I'll do anything for you so long as you turn up with a lot of money and ring me before you do anything type thing. So what I'm putting to you is that in order to get to that point of growth that I had originally on this growth curve, saying, well, that's point A, where most of you would be at as successful firms looking at the next stage. In order to get to that point, you've probably done all three of those things well. So you'll have a partner who does commercial work for a stable of clients, many of whom he's godparent to the children or she's godparent to the children, very much a client intimacy model. Out the front you'll have a conveyancing section, process-focused model. Between the two organisations you'll have a couple of clever people that you don't let go anywhere near a client who just do particularly clever stuff. That model is not going to be as successful during challenged times as picking one. And the reason being because the most powerful thing you can do to galvanise a business is to get your culture to match product offering. And it's most important during challenged times. The reason why I say that, by the way, and it would take me a long time to explain it to you, but if you think intuitively about it, the fact is that people who thrive in a process-focused organisation are usually hardwired to do so. Similarly, people who thrive in a client-intimate organisation are usually hardwired to do so. It's very difficult to teach somebody the enduringly sensible concept of the customer is always right. When I first started working with lawyers, I was convinced it was a learnt skill. 22 years into it, crap, you're born with it or you're not, it seems to me. A lot of our attitudinal approach to life is hardwired before our 14th birthday, so it's very difficult for you to turn around to someone and say, all right, you're not by nature a client, intimate type person, you'll never... If you don't believe me, go and have dinner in a Sydney restaurant. None of them want to be waiters, they all want to be artists, but there's no film industry, so begrudgingly they throw your dinner at you. That's the concept. So it's always those, to continue with that analogy, it's always the restaurants. You go to contrast that with Melbourne, where there are professional waiters been waiters their whole life, all they ever wanted to do was be a waiter. Great experience. That's what I mean. So that, although we haven't had really a lot of time to talk about it, but that I think is your most important set of decisions coming into these challenging economic times. If I can go back. So what I would do if I were you is, firstly, I think you're probably going to be pretty well advised to look at the systems that you've got in place, how you're providing services to clients, making sure that, and tomorrow, those of you who are joining me tomorrow, we're going to talk about costs, a lot of which, by the way, is related to your whole service delivery approach, but we'll talk about it tomorrow. But for those of you who aren't going to be there tomorrow, clearly the way you enter into a fee agreement with a client, the way you talk to your clients about when you're going to expect to be paid is extremely important. So those systems that you're going to put in place, essential. I think that's probably one of the most important things. Now, having said that, a couple of tips from last time round that we saw when the market tanked. Law firms, it's with interest that I watch for, it's been in the press, so public knowledge, we can talk about it. I'm not letting any cats out of the bag, but when you look at the way, for instance, in Australia, Blakes have managed the whole downsourcing exercise. Now, bear in mind, when you read in the paper 100 people have been laid off, you gasp, you think, geez, that's a lot. But proportionately, it's probably like most of us letting the tea lady go. It's not, in the grand scheme of things, they're a very, very large organisation. But it's not, from my perspective, fabulous cultural management to put 100 people, if we're led to believe the paper, which is a long stretch, but to put 100 people on the footpath 3 weeks ago, 80 people on the footpath last week, and Lord knows what's to come. In your firms, if you're faced with a scenario of having to downsize to match your provision with the market, don't do it in dribs and drabs. There are two very important sample populations here. One is the people who are going to go. The second one are the people who are going to stay. Clearly, 90% of your attention has to be focused on the people who are going to stay. What do you think happens to your culture if you free up the career opportunities of one person once a week for the next 4 years? Clearly it's going to be cancerous. If you're going to make a cut, it's got to happen. You've got to be generous, it's got to happen decisively, and it should happen once. Now, the other big mistake that firms made during the last downturn was, this is a typical law firm model, all right? Partners, associates, employed solicitors, and various levels of support. A couple of interesting things. Firstly, since 1927, when law firms downsize, they've done it about 5 times since then. That was when we really saw the birth of the corporate law firm with cravats in the United States. Since 1927, lawyers have downsized in a ratio of 70-30. Support lawyers.